All right, what is up, guys? Today, I'm going to show you the best bead rig you've ever seen. So I'm going to set it up here, show you how we do it. So I'm going to grab my rod here that I want to set up my bead rig. So it's going to be a float fishing bead rig. And this rod it's got a spinner on it right now, and I want to put a float on it. So I'm going to just kind of go through the whole process of how I do that. Now this is a Lamiglass rod. It's a bait caster. It's like a 9.5 foot rod. You could use a bait casting rod, a spinning rod, a center pin rod, whatever you want for this setup. Today I'm just running the bait caster, but I prefer a longer rod, something over like 9.5 feet long and longer, just so you can get good drifts, have a good mend, and pick up your line fast with that longer rod. And then for the reel, I like a bait caster or a center pin, because the bait caster and a center pin allows you to free spool that thing and be really tight to that bobber. And when it goes down, you're really quick on the hook set. The spinning reels, they're easier to cast for a lot of people, especially when they're just learning how to fish. But when you have to deal with flipping the bail back and forth and a lot of line being dumped out on the water, you tend to miss a lot more fish. So I think it's more efficient to go with the bait caster overall. So let's go ahead and set this up. This rod is also rated 10 to 15, but I'd go something in like that 6 to 12 or like 8 to 17, 10 to 20. You don't need to go super heavy. Most of these steelhead are, unless you're chasing, giant teen size steelhead, most of them you're gonna handle just fine with like a 6 to 12 rating rod. It's just up to you. A bigger river, you might want a heavier rod. If you're targeting those wild fish, big, wild fish, you might want to go with a 10 to 20. But for most rivers, something like a 6 to 12 or a 10 to 15, it's going to be a pretty good rod. So I'm going to go ahead and get this line. Right now I got the spinner on. This video is going to be a little chaotic. Okay, but I'm pulling some line off my spool. For my line here, I'm running a 50-pound braided line. Now the 50-pound braided line floats pretty good, but it's also thin enough that it's going to cut through the water and let my bobber weight get down. And right now it's got a leader on it with a spinner, so I'm cutting this leader off of there. So I've got just straight braided line coming off of my reel. You can use high-vis braid. This is just a green braided line. The high-vis braid, the yellows, the orange braids, are really nice because it makes it easy to see your line on the water to manage that line, but it can spook some fish. So if you do that, I'd recommend running a bumper line, but I like to just usually use this dark green braided line and just go right down to my bobber weight. So show you how to do this. So I'm gonna open my little box here with my bobber stuff. And you're gonna wanna start with a bobber stop. So got this line, and this is similar to the bobber and jig video I showed, just a little bit different. But I'm gonna start with a bobber stop, okay? So for bobber stops, I like to use these little guys, just little rubber ones that stick on, or that slide up your line. So I put one, sometimes I put two of these, but a lot of times just one of them is fine. Wet that line to make it slide a little bit. If that line's not wet and you slide that around, it can wear that stop out a lot faster. So I like to wet it down a bit. Then I'm gonna run a bead. Now this is gonna protect my bobber. It's gonna protect my bobber from sliding over the top of that bobber stop. And it's also gonna protect the eye on my fishing rod, so when I reel up, I'm not jamming that bobber up. I got that bead. And you want to make sure that bead's not going to go over the stop. Slide that up a little bit. And then I'm going to grab my bobber. This is a super simple setup, you guys. So for my bobber, you kind of got to dictate, depending on water. If you're going to be fishing those bigger rivers where, people are using sleds and bigger drift boats with, kickers on them, you're going to want to go with a bigger bobber. Those rivers that are going to be flowing, they're going to be bigger. You could go up to like an ounce bobber. But for a lot of the rivers I'm fishing, I'm bank fishing. They're smaller. you know, medium to small sized rivers that, you know, guys are putting the smaller drift boats in, their rafts in. I'm doing a lot of bank fishing, right? So for those rivers, a standard like 1/2 ounce is going to be pretty good. So this is a 1/2 ounce, a 3/8 of an ounce bobber is a really good one as well, but I like to go with the 1/2 ounce. So I'm going to slide this up here. I like to go with like a Bomac or the clear drift ones. I just have a little bit more confidence in them. And I really like the way they flow in the water. How is this line so tangled up? Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So I really like these, you know, Bomac or clear drift ones, the clear ones. They seem to float really good in the water. They track really well, and they're pretty sensitive. Sometimes the foam ones are going to be less sensitive, and there can be a little bit off. Like this is a 3/8 ounce, but some of these you can put, you know, it'll say 3/8 ounce, but you could put like almost an ounce on these before it actually goes under. So it's not as sensitive, and they don't track in the water as good sometimes. But I use them. But my favorite is going to be like a Bomac clear drift style 1/2 ounce. Okay, so I got that bobber slid up. Now I'm going to put a little bead on to protect that bobber, right? You want those beads on there in between the bobber, because if you have a knot or, you know, a swivel or whatever, and that bobber is banging on it, it'll break. Especially these bobbers, it'll break them, it'll crack them. These ones, the inserts on them will pop out, and you get jammed up in there. So always have a protector bead underneath of your bobber. Let that braid try to get it through. Okay, so that protector bead's going down. So I've got my bobber stop, a bead, bobber, and a little protector bead there. And then what I like to do is tie on my bobber weight. So this is a 1/2 ounce bobber. I'm going to match that and go with a 1/2 ounce weight. Okay. Now, sometimes, you know, like I'm fishing, like I showed you that worm and jig setup, right, where I'm going to be adding more weight underneath. I kind of have to kind of play it by ear. You know what I mean? If I'm going to be running like a jig head under this or something, and I throw a 1/2 ounce weight on a 1/2 ounce bobber, it might overweight it. So you have to be careful. But with a bead, a lot of times I'll throw the weight that it says, right? The 1/2 ounce bobber, I'll throw a 1/2 ounce bobber weight under it. 3/8 ounce bobber, I'll throw a 3/8 ounce weight under it. So I can match that up pretty close or right at it. Okay, so I'm going to tie on. I like to use a Palmer knot. I know I did that really quick. You guys can look up whatever knot you want, but with braided line, it slips really easily. Because it's such a slick line, like your fluorocarbons, your monofilaments, they catch each other, right? They dig into each other. As you pull your knot down, it'll actually dig into itself, which can weaken the line, which is why usually your knots will fail when you break off. But this braid can't really dig into itself, so it slides on itself a lot easier. So you want to make sure you do a good, strong knot that's not going to slide. You pull it down really, really tight. You're not really going to hurt the line. You're just going to make sure that it's nice and tight and it's not going to slip when you hook a big steelhead. All right, so then after you got your weight on, so we'll go over it really quick. Bobber stop, bead to protect that. Bobber, another bead to protect it. Your bobber weight, that's a 1/2 ounce bobber, 1/2 ounce weight. Then on the other side of this weight, and I like to use the inline weights for this setup. Maybe I'll go over a bobber dogging setup when I use like the 3-way swivel, but for this one, this is going to be the most versatile bead rig that you can fish. So I like that weight like that, so it's more vertical, okay? So here is what makes this rig so special. Okay, now under here, I've seen guys run their beads all different ways. I've seen guys run, you know, that setup, and then they run, you know, like a little 1 foot or 2 foot leader with a split shot or with no split shot. I've seen guys run, you know, 6 and 7 foot leaders with a split shot or no split shot, okay? But what I found to be the most versatile, now obviously if you get into some super low conditions, you got to change it up. if you get into some super deep boily water, you've got to change it up. But overall, 90% of the time, you know, when I'm just running and gunning on the bank, or if you're in a drift boat or a raft and you're just floating down, hitting little pockets and hitting these holes, this bead rig I'm going to show you will get that bead down there fast and efficiently. Okay, so what I do, this has kind of been a little secret, so hopefully none of my friends get mad, but there's some videos on it. I think Addicted's done videos and tutorials on it, but what I do is I'm going to take some 15-pound fluorocarbon, okay? Now for this, I like to run 2 sections of line, okay? I'm going to use a heavier line up top and a lighter line. Now you can pick, if the water's low and clear, I use a 12-pound to a 10-pound, or a 10-pound to an 8-pound, but most of the time like a 15-pound to a 12-pound is going to work for most water conditions. So I'm going to take this 15-pound and I'm going to run about 3 feet of this 15-pound, okay? And I'm going to cut it. So I've got about 3-ish feet, a little over 3 feet of this 15-pound fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon is key because it sinks in the water, it's very invisible, and it's very abrasive resistant, right? When you hit those rocks down there, it holds up. So fluorocarbon, 15-pound. I'm going to tie that to the swivel off of my bobber weight. Now I like to use just a fisherman's knot or a clinch knot. Give it a couple twists and go back through, okay? Now wet it down so you don't burn that line, because if you pull this line tight without wetting that down, it'll actually cause friction on that line and weaken it. And then when I pull that down, I talked about this when I pulled that braided line tight, you know, these fluorocarbons and monofilaments will dig into themselves. So when I pull that down, I'm just snugging it out. I'm not sitting here reefing on it, because all you're doing every time you reef on it is you're just pulling that into itself and weakening your knot, okay? A lot of times the fish, when you hook up, you're not really, except for a hook set, which most of the time you can set the hook really hard, but by the time it gets down to the fish, it's not really pulling that hard. And most of the time, this line, if you sit there and just pop, 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 it will shock it, and you can break off and weaken your knot. So don't sit there and yank on it. Just snug it down nice and tight. Make sure it's not going to slip, obviously, but just get it snug, okay? So I'm going to run this. I'm going to make sure that's about probably 3 feet or about 1 arm's length, okay? And then I'm going to tie a swivel to this. So I'm going to trim this up a little bit. Wasted a few inches here, I know. Gosh darn. Fluorocarbon's expensive. But then I'm going to grab a swivel. Now I like to run a smaller swivel. Some guys will run, you know, like a 7 is a pretty good one. I like to run like a size 10. Little tiny size 10 barrel swivel, okay? And I'm going to tie this on, and I'm going to use the same exact knot, just clinch knot, fisherman's knot. Wrap it around a few times. And swivels are kind of hard to tie this knot, because as you're twisting, the swivel is doing what it's designed to do, and it is trying to spin to not let that line twist. I'm going to wet it down and pull it tight. Just snug it up tight. But like I said, when you're tying to a barrel swivel, the swivels are designed to twist, so that way it eliminates line twist and gives your bait more freedom. So you have to be careful, and I'm doing that clinch knot and I'm twisting that line. That swivel wants to counter that and twist back. So you want to make sure that as you're twisting, that swivel's just not, you know, unwinding and you're not doing anything. So got the swivel tied on. That's probably like a size 10 swivel. All right. So I have that about 3 foot or like 1 arm's length to that swivel. Then I'm going to take my 12-pound or lighter leader, and I'm going to run this about 3 feet. So I'm going to take this, pull off about 3 feet, another arm's length, or a little bit longer than an arm's length, and snip it. And I always cut them a little bit longer. Yeah, you might waste a little piece in the end, but I cut it a little longer, and then I can always go shorter. If you cut it too short, then you get it all set up and you're like, dang it, that's a little shorter than I wanted it. And you can't add anything to it. You got to start over. So I cut off that 12 pound underneath that 15, right? So I got this leader here. Now this is going to be where you put your bead, okay? So I cut that 12, about 3-ish feet. So now I'm going to decide, the first thing I'm going to do is decide what size of bead I'm going to fish, okay? You don't necessarily have to pick your color, but I've got, a bead box here in front of me, and I want to go, okay, what size of bead am I going to be fishing? Because that's going to determine what size of hook I'm going to run, okay? So like I'm looking at a box here, you might look at the river, see what your bead's kind of speaking to you or what size. If the river's low and clear, you might want to go with a small, a little like 10 mil or 8 mil bead. If it's higher, go to a 14 or a 16. I probably am going to go with something like this right here. That's like a 14 millimeter. That's an Incognito by Lured by the Bead. I think that's a genocide color. Might be wrong on that. But it's like a milked out color, but it's got some pink in there. One of my favorites. Okay, so that's a 14 millimeter bead. So with a 14, I like to run a size 2 bead hook. Now this is the Addicted Advantage bead hook, and I think the way they designed this hook, it is one of the best bead hooks that you can get. I've tried some different ones, and I seem to actually hook up and land more fish with these Addicted bead hooks. So that's a size about a 14 millimeter bead, so I'm going to run that size 2. For my like 12 and 14 mils, I like the size 2. When I drop down to any smaller, I like a size 4. It's like a 10 millimeter bead, I run a size 4 hook. And then when I get up to like the 16s, the 20 mil, I will go to a size 1 or even a 1/0 hook at that point. But for this one, I'm going to tie on my size 2 hook. So it's important that you match that hook correctly. You don't want to be fishing a tiny hook with a big bead because it's going to be very hard to get that hook into that fish. But you don't want to fish that big, huge hook if you're going to be running a little tiny bead because it's going to drag that bead down to the bottom. It's not going to be flowing in the current and fishing as natural like it should be. These beads, you want them fluttering very natural. I think that's why beads are so effective, because the presentation, you get this bead down here, there, and it's just kind of fluttering in the current really natural, which is hard to do with other presentations. So if you use too big a hook, it's going to kill that action. So there's my size 2 hook. I do an egg loop knot on these. And the reason I do an egg loop is because it gets that hook kicked up. You might be able to see that. So that hook's not straight. It's actually kicked up a little bit like that. So I feel like when you rip that hook through their mouth, it catches better. All right, so then how I like to peg my beads, I'm using the Incognito beads pretty much 100% of the time, 99% of the time. I do run some of his soft beads or some of the DRO soft beads every once in a while, but 90% of the time I'm running the Incognito. Now the Incognito, you can see it on this one here. What he did is it's a soft shell on the outside with a hard bead in the middle. So you get the best of both worlds. You get the fishability of the hard bead. It's flowing down through the water really good. You get the neutral buoyancy of the soft cover on it. You get that egg look, some of these clearer colors, right? Like this color, you can't really see it. This color, you get like that two-tone color. You got that clear outside with the red middle. Or like one of these ones, these are killer, clear outside with the orange middle, a little bit of pink in there maybe. So killer beads. And with that hard bead on the inside, I like to peg it with these little tiny, you can't even see that. It's a little tiny bead, like a 2 or 3 millimeter bead. And I'm gonna slide this down my line. You guys aren't gonna be able to see this. I have a better tutorial on how to actually tie this up. Maybe I'll link it down below. I do a little better job, but I'm going to slide that little bead on there. You can see that bead, and I'm going to get this bead where I want it. Now I usually do about 2 to 3 fingers away from that hook, okay? And I'm going to put my line back through that bead. So I ran it through twice, and it creates this loop around the bead. And then I take my hook, and I run it through this loop a couple times, usually like 4 or 5 times. The lighter the line, the less I do. The thicker the line, I usually do, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. It just depends how I feel, honestly. Okay. So now what it's doing is it's pulling a knot around that bead, and you can kind of move this little bead where you want it, get it about as far as I want it, wet it down, and pull it tight. So that is my bead tied in, and that's about 3 fingers, 2.5, 3 fingers away from that hook. Now this gap can make all the difference in the world. You know, if you're fishing a hole, your bobber goes down and you're missing fish, and you know, sometimes I'll do that. Like if I have a couple, you get to a hole, you throw in there, and it's like, oh, I missed one. That had to be a fish. Throw back in there. A couple casts later, bang, you missed one again. A lot of times I will switch my leader. You know, maybe that bead is too far away or too close. If I miss a fish or two, sometimes I cut this off and retie one and do either a little bit closer or a little further away than I had my original one. So you kind of got to play with it a little bit. Now, what's nice about like other stops, like if you use like some kind of bobber stop setup, right? You can adjust that much easier. But when the fish bite it, they rip that down every time. Okay, so I got this fixed bead. I'm going to slide on my actual bead I'm going to fish, my lured bead. Okay, so with that setup, that bead's never going to slide down. Okay, it can slide up, although as soon as that bead hits the current, it sucks tight to that stop every single time. I've never had an issue. Some people ask, well, when you have it free sliding, does it slide up the line? But as soon as it gets in the current and starts drifting, it will suck tight right up to that stop usually. So with that inline and these incognito beads, or just a straight hard bead, here's a hard bead by Lured by the Bead. He makes some good hard beads as well. That's a blood clot hard bead I just showed you. Really good color. But they will never slide down. So when those fish grab it, that bead will never slide over that hook. When you use a bobber stop style, or you know, these T-stops, a lot of times they slide. So that fish will grab it and that stop will slide right over the hook, and you never hook those fish. With this right here, it's never gonna slide. I can bang it around on the rocks, you know, tumble it along the bottom. Never worry about that bead sliding and covering that hook. When a fish grabs it, pops out of their mouth, and look at that. You get the hook right in the corner, just like that. Boom, every time. Right, that bead's not gonna get in the way of that hook. So that is how I peg my beads. Okay, so then I'm gonna take this leader, which is about another arm's length, so about 3-ish feet. And I'm gonna tie this to that swivel with the 15 pound on it, right? So I got that 15 pound coming to my swivel here. I'm gonna tie on this bead leader to this other side of the swivel. And same thing, I'm gonna just do my clinch knot, couple wraps, wet it down a little bit, pull it tight, and snip your tag in. Now, if you're in the house like I am, make sure to pick those up because the wife will vacuum those up and you'll get an earful. So make sure you pick your tag ends up. So that is what my setup looks like. Okay, so we'll go from the top to the bottom. Okay, we got our bobber stop, our bead, our bobber, another bead, our weight. Then we have about 3 feet of 15 pound fluorocarbon to a swivel, another 3 feet down to this bead. Okay, now what I do from here is I'm going to take a split shot, and I like to run a good size is a number 7. These are like Eagle Claw, number 7 split shot. Now this really depends on the hole you're fishing and the flow of the river. Is how I'm going to determine my split shot. But most of the time I can use a number 7 split shot, and I'm going to go on the 15 pound fluorocarbon side, right? The one closest to my bobber, that heavier leader. And I'm going to pinch it on right above that swivel. Okay, so it's pinched on right above that swivel. So what that does, and like I said, you could add more weight to this. You could use a bigger split shot, smaller split shot. You can put a couple. You know, sometimes I put 2 or 3 split shot right there. What you want that to do is to get down to the bottom of the river. Okay, so with this setup, you're going to cast it out here, and it's going to be in line like this. And what I do is I adjust my bobber stop up to where this split shot is going to be ticking along the bottom. Okay, when I'm bead fishing, I always want some kind of weight either right next to the bottom or bouncing on the bottom, because it's very important that you keep this bead rolling around right on the bottom, because those steelhead are going to be sitting 90% of the time, if not 100% of the time, they're going to be sitting belly on the bottom. Okay, unless you got some weird boils and things like that and they're suspended behind rocks, that's different. But most of the time in your steelhead runs, your little pockets, your little dips where they're hanging out at, your tail outs, they're going to be right on the bottom. So you want this split shot to be down there, tumbling, bouncing around on the bottom. And then this bead is going to be down there too. So that's why you got to adjust that split shot. You know, if I don't think it's getting down there next to the bottom, I'm going to add a little bit more weight. Or if it's dragging too hard on the bottom, if it's really shallow, I shallowed up my bobber stop all the way, and the split shot's just dragging pretty hard on the bottom because I'm only fishing a 2-foot riffle, then I'm going to use a smaller split shot. But for this setup, you can fish a lot of water, right? Because you can run that stop right up to your bobber, and you can fish a foot of water to about 3 feet of water with that stop right up against your bobber. And that weight is just going to be kind of down there, bouncing, ticking along the bottom, and that bead will be right behind it. And then as you get deeper, right, we pull into the next little run, or we're, in the drift boat, and we're drifting along. And I know this hole coming up is going to be, like 6 feet deep. I run this up about another 3 feet. So now, where this is going to be about 6 feet. So now this is going to be tapping that bottom in that 6 feet of water, and that bead's going to be down there right behind it. And this rig is probably the easiest rig to stay fishing on the river at all times. You can fish this because you can fish this through such shallow, skinny water, or you can slide that stop up really quick and fish it through deeper holes. It's very effective to getting that bead down there. Having that split shot with that swivel in the middle is very effective. Now, a lot of times I will run a straight leader. So this altogether is about a 6-foot leader, right? 3 feet of 15, 3 feet of 12. So if I hold this out, it's about 6 feet altogether. Now, sometimes I'll just cut off, and you might be asking, why didn't I just do this? I'll run just like a 6-foot leader, pull off like 10 or 12 pound line, pull off 6 feet, and that is my leader. Instead of having a swivel in between, I'll just run a straight 6-foot leader. But the reason that I started doing this is because now when you get snagged up, 90% of the time, if this split shot gets hung up in the rocks, you get it back, okay? And that's why if I use 15 or even 20 pound leader for this first half, that split shot and the swivel get snagged in a rock, you give it a yank, and that split shot will either pop off of there or just pull right out of that rock. And you're going to get that back. Now, if that bead hook hooks into a log or a rock and you can't get it back and you got to break off, you're only going to break off this bottom half of this leader right here. And then I can grab a pre-tied leader. I've got just a bunch of bead leaders here, little 3-foot sections of bead leader, pull one out, tie it on really quick, and you're back to fishing. And most of the time that split shot's still going to be sitting there. So I don't have to worry about tying that long leader. I don't have to worry about pinching another split shot on because I broke off below that swivel. So I can just tie on a new 3-foot section and cast right back into the hole. So that's the way I think that a lot of people prefer. It's going to be a little bit easier to run for a lot of the beginners. But I also will, like I said, just pull off straight 6 feet and throw it out there. And you can use, the longer you go with that, I've seen guys throw like an 8-foot leader for these beads. The longer you go, the harder it's going to be to cast, okay? And this is not a flossing setup. A lot of guys like, oh, you're running a 6-foot leader, you're just flossing them with the bead. But you know how hard it's going to be with the setup underneath a bobber to actually efficiently floss a fish, especially, you know, 1 or 2 steelheads sitting in a run. It'd be extremely hard to floss a fish purposely with this, you know what I mean? This is just a very effective way to fish it. And with the 6-foot leader, in reality, you're really just getting this bead or the split shot down there and what actually is fishing from the bottom. That split shot's ticking the bottom, and then you have this 3-foot leader down here, right? So this leader is not like dragging across the bottom. It's not like you're sweeping a 6-foot leader down the river, right? In reality, only this 3-foot section with your bead on it is going to be what's down there actually on the bottom, right? So all you haters out there that are saying that we just floss fish with beads, get out of here. I mean, I've seen guys do it, but it takes some skill, honestly, and it takes some try, right? You have to use, I mean, I've seen guys run like just a bobber dog setup, a big old piece of weight right here, and like a 10-foot leader with no split shot on it. And at that point, they're just sweeping it through the hole. But this setup, very effective. Throw in the hole and a split shot drops down. You want the split shot ticking the bottom. And then you want this bead, which I hooked that spinner with, just floating back there behind it, just kind of tumbling in the rocks. So that is one of the most effective bead rigs you will ever see. If you're not catching fish on a bead, maybe compare this rig to yours, see what difference there is. Maybe try this one and go out there, give it a try, and you'll be surprised how good this bead setup works. So anyway, thanks for watching, you guys. I know it was another long one, but I really wanted to get in-depth videos because I don't really have that many. So in-depth videos. I did one about the fixed float with the center pin. I did one about the bobber and jig / worm. And this one is going to be the ultimate favorite for most people, the bobber and bead setup. Okay, so this is going to be the most effective bead setup. And it's going to get in all those little pockets. It's going to fish the tail out. It's going to fish a ton of water. Versus if I had a bobber dog setup, it's not going to fish all kinds of water. If I had that short setup with a couple split shot, it's not going to fish a lot of water unless you're constantly adjusting your float. This, I can fish very effectively, very quickly through 90% of water. And if a fish is going to eat a bead, you can get him. So that is my bead setup. Thanks for watching, y'all. Get out there and hook some fish, man. I got my first winter, depending on when you're seeing this, I got my first winter a few weeks ago, and there's a nice big buck on a big pink worm. And so it's good to see some big wild fish out there. So get out there and get them, guys.